Today I sat down with Peter Klutt, the founder and owner of legendary motorcar company, and also my dad. He's been buying and selling collector cars for almost 50 years with a stellar investing history and a true love and passion for collector cars. He breaks down for me the art and science of investing in the car market. So without further ado, Peter Klutt. So the art and science of investing in collector cars. I just so happen to have one of the world's experts in the same building. That would be a good interview.
Well, hopefully you grew up around the art and science.
To some degree, for sure.
Usually it's just, yeah.
No. And I think, you've so internalized all your processes and the way you do things is, I don't think you realize, I mean, I'm sure you do when you articulate it, but there are so many boxes to check and so many criteria to check that you just do it subconsciously. But I think for you to explain it to people would be very illuminating.
Yeah, it's I guess after doing it for 40 years, that it's sort of second nature. And I think there's various aspects to, if you want to call it the art and science of investing in cars. My number one rule, if you're a collector, a true collector, not a dealer, not just an investor, but a collector and like cars, is buy what you like first. Because I've had cars that I bought purely on the investment, purely on the thought that I was going to make a profit on it.
Right.
And when that went awry, I didn't like the car, and I think, and I've had other cars where it's gone awry. The investment hasn't panned out, but I love the car and I could care less if it sits there for the next 20 years. I just really like the car. Right. It's not purely about the investment. So I think a lot of times you have to separate the two a little bit.
Right.
And it's not saying one is mutually exclusive of the other, but you have to really decide what you're trying to do.
Right. So first off, really decide what you're trying to do. If you're going to be driving the car twice a week, different story than buying a car that's completely done and you're trying to retire off of this investment or hand it down to your kids and, they're going to make a bunch of money from it. So I guess let's back up. Let's start with what you think is a good investment. So, for some people, they think, it went up. I bought it in 1980. I sold it in 2015, and I made this amount of money. But they didn't actually look at the cost of that money or the cost of if they invested somewhere else over that number of years.
Sure. So there's long-term investing, where you have to believe that the cars are going to go up more than the rate of inflation, more than your money in the bank or other investments. Now, having said that, you might say, well, if my criteria for good investments are I want to make 6 or 7% a year in the stock market or wherever else, then that should be your baseline if you're buying the car purely as an investment. But if you're also enjoying the car along the way, you probably could say, well, I'm going to take a little bit less of a return. Plus, if you're buying and trading a stock and you're trading it all the time, you're paying the capital gains, you're paying the passive income tax rate of whatever it is. So this way you're also enjoying the car. So it's a little bit different from that point of view. But I always look at it and say, if you're doing long-term investing, look at cars that are desirable, number one, because that it has to be a desirable car. You can have a super rare car,
sure,
that isn't desirable. The reason it's rare is nobody wanted it then and nobody wants it today.
Right.
So, it's really rare, but nobody wants it. So desirability is a big thing. Rarity is a big thing, and usually that happens with desirable cars because they were probably expensive in the day. And then history is another big thing, and especially for race cars, which, you know, a lot of the really expensive cars are in the world happen to be race cars because they have more than just the cool story. They have different histories. You know, the reason that you had Lewis Hamilton's Formula One car sell last year at Vegas for almost $20 million, and then you get a test car that looks identical to the car, same performance, same everything, same car, just doesn't have the Lewis Hamilton history, is worth $1 million.
Right.
Huge difference,
right,
just purely on history. So that's another aspect of collecting, is what is the history of that particular car.
Right. And then I guess quality of the car is, you know, when you're at that level of historical cars, the quality is less important because, you know, a super historical car, it takes whatever, $500,000 to $1 million to fix that, the quality issue.
Correct.
And then documentation, right?
Sure. Documentation and, you know, verifying what the history is, and then how good are the bones of the car. So you're absolutely right to, you know, to take a great car that's been sitting for 50 years and it's been sitting in the barn and the paint's dilapidated and the interior's ripped and torn, but it's got its original motor, original body, original chassis. All of the bones are really good. On the outside, it's $1 million, let's say, to make it look brand new, ready for Pebble Beach. On a 8-figure car, that's a smaller component of it. Having said that, you could have the most beautiful looking car that the guy just spent $1 million on, but it was crashed, burned, rolled into a ball, and, you know, it's like Washington's axe. There's nothing left of the original car. That's going to be worth a lot less, no matter how shiny it looks.
Right.
So bones become very important, what the car started or what it went through in its lifetime.
Right, right. When did you first, because you've been, you know, officially doing this as a business since what, 84?
85, yeah, 40 years.
And even a little bit before that. And that was, you know, 20 years or even less after kind of the heyday of the muscle car stuff. So it was very early on. When did you first realize that there was this investing component to the business as opposed to just, you know, buying something, fixing it up, or buying low, selling high?
I think in 1980, between 85 and 90, when you had that huge run up on cars where cars literally doubled, tripled, quadrupled in a 5-year period. And sometimes it was 10x in that 5-year period, depending on the cars.
What kind of car?
A lot of Ferraris. Take a Ferrari 4Cam. $85,000 in 85 to $1.5 million in 1990. It was more than 10x.
Wow.
So there were cars that did that, and that really opened my eyes, and that's when I started, is, you know, in 1985 officially. And then by 1990, you know, for those 5 years, it was really idiot-proof. You couldn't help but make money on just about everything. And, you know, and that idea of a high tide raises all ships is very true. For the most part, everything went up.
Right. What kind of stuff do guys have to be concerned about so they don't lose money on cars?
I think number one is making sure that let's assume you buy what you think you're buying.
Right.
You know, you didn't buy something that wasn't real, or, you know, had a problem with it that wasn't
as advertised.
As advertised.
Sure.
So, and, you know, doing your due diligence and making sure that there isn't, you know, any bad issues with the car, and knowing the car a little bit. You know, like, I look at a car and I take it for granted. Within, you know, 5 minutes of looking at a car, I can pretty much tell you if it was a rusty old car to start with, even if it's been restored or if it's been beat up and hit and bashed. And, you know, you can, after doing 40 years of restoration, you can tell in a hurry if it started life as a good car or not.
Right.
So let's just assume that you're getting what you're paying for. I think the next thing is, you know, demographics. Is it a car that is still desirable to a big market of people? And as years go on, I mean, traditionally, cars from the 20s, 30s, 40s are less desirable today than they were 60 years ago. Even cars from the 50s and 60s are probably a little less desirable than they were 10 years ago because you have this new group of younger guys coming in that like the cars from the 90s and even the 2000s, which, now is like a 2000 model car is almost 25 years old.
Right.
When I started in business, a 65 Shelby, it was less than 20 years old. It was a relatively new car. So I think that the demographics, you can look at it, but great cars, it doesn't matter from what era, continue to be great cars and continue to go up. You can have, a W196 race car that's worth $30 million from eras that the rest of the cars in that era, just nobody wants them anymore. Nobody wants a Model A and a Model T and, cars from the 50s. A 56 T-Bird's been the same price for 30 years.
Right.
They haven't really gone down,
sure,
which is fine, but they haven't gone up either. So that wouldn't have been a good investment for a guy to buy a car 30 years ago for 50 grand and have it still be worth 50 grand today.
Right. So, picking cars that people want and that a good number of people want. How important do you think is our looks? How
Huge.
good a car looks?
Huge. A friend of mine years ago said it has to be really desirable, it has to be a good looking car. Because let's face it, cars are about passion, and how many people come in and they look at a car and they go, oh, that is the best looking car. And you look at the lines, it's a piece of art. It really is. It's a sculpture. And whether it's a functional sculpture or a sculpture that's, sitting on somebody's desk or sitting out in front of somebody's place, a statue, whatever, it has to be aesthetically pleasing. And some cars just are way better looking than other cars. And sometimes it's pretty subtle.
Right. So let's go through a little bit of, if you can just be, very macro, very broad on kind of the cycles that the car markets have gone through, looking at the Ferrari stuff in the 80s and 90s, the muscle car stuff in the early 2000s, and then kind of what happened 2012, 14, 15. Just kind of paint a picture of the landscape of investing in cars.
So like I said, I think the first big run up between 85 and 90, then you had, more than a dip. It went off hard from say 90 until 2000. And then you had a run up again between 2000 and 2007, the financial crisis.
Right.
So you had a 10-year depreciation for a couple years and then steady. Then you had a run up again of certain cars, muscle cars.
Right.
Specifically, less so the European cars. Then they got overheated.
The muscle cars. They dropped back in 08. Right.
In the financial crisis, and European cars took off, Ferraris and Lambos and all that sort of stuff. And then they kind of peaked in, call it 2015. And then you had a sideways, maybe a slightly downward trend for a few years until we got to COVID. And then literally I thought it was the end of the world when COVID hit. I mean, how are we going to sell cars? People are worried about living, not about buying cars, and nobody can travel. And, I thought it's going to be horrendous. And I think just about everybody in the car business thought that was going to happen.
Initially.
Me included.
Yep.
And even panicked and sold some cars that, doubled in the next year or two in value. Sold an F50. I thought, big cars that are going to go down. Sold an F50. The guy I sold it to doubled his money in 2 years, from $2.5 million to $5 million. And so some of those swings just,
well, they're purely,
you can't account for it.
No, and they happen in any investment. They're purely macro factors. No one knew that COVID would happen and they'd print 400% of the money supply.
It's a black swan event.
Yeah.
Okay, so the financial crisis of '08, black swan event, COVID, black swan event.
Right.
And they can affect the markets differently. The one that goes down and goes in the toilet instantly, and the other one, initially goes down for a couple months and then it goes gangbusters, the opposite that I think everybody would have thought.
Right. Right. So where are we at now, in your mind anyways, as far as kind of the trajectory maybe for the next 5 years kind of thing?
So I think that the day of buying a brand new car, and you can use a McLaren, a Porsche, a Ferrari, whatever, and sort of the run-of-the-mill cars, not their supercars, but a GT3 RS or, a 48 or, any of those sort of cars that are hot, they're hard to get. A Corvette, a Z06 when they first came out. All of those, a Challenger, a Demon, all of those cars were well over list price. If you got one, you were making money.
Right, 2021, 22, yep.
Yeah, if you had one on order and you got it early on, you were making real money. And traditionally, when I started in business, you bought a car because you loved the car, it was going to be worth less. If you bought a brand new Porsche or Ferrari or whatever it was back in the day, 6 months later, a year later, it's worth less than you paid.
Right.
It had to pay its dues. It had to go through that 5-10 year cycle before it started going up again.
Right. It had to become an older collectible. Yeah,
right.
collector car.
And I think the manufacturers did a good job of kind of jumping on that collector bandwagon by creating special models. And, you take a look at something like a Veyron, Chiron, Devo, they're all basically the same car, but there's a bigger price tag every time attached to it.
Right.
So manufacturers got smart and they said, hey, why are these guys making all the dough? We can make some dough on it as well.
Right.
And I think that they've priced themselves, fairly aggressively, and now we're back to the days of you buy a new, like maybe not a supercar, but you buy a new car, the GT3 RS, and I'm not harping on Porsche, but it's just an easy example.
Whatever, Corvette, whatever it is.
Yeah, Corvette. It's going to go down for a little bit. You better buy it because you like it, you want to drive it, you want to enjoy it. Or be in it for the 20, 30-year haul.
Right. Right. So that was kind of the foolproof time in those couple years where you could just, as long as you could get one, you just bought one new and made money. And some guys were even buying a new Porsche, taking it to the track, beating the crap out of it for 6 months.
And getting all their money plus some back.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah.
Right. So there's been some kind of cultural effects on the market, and I guess, as more and more people kind of pay attention to, say, motorsports, for example, you look at Drive to Survive.
Sure.
And what kind of effect does that have on the market as a whole, the race car market, the old race car market, the new race car market, all that?
It's very interesting. So I think pop culture has always affected, James Dean with the 550 Porsche, Steve McQueen with the Bullet car.
Burt Reynolds,
Burt Reynolds with the Smokey and the Bandit cars. There's always, and sometimes it takes a little time for those to click in.
Yeah, or become nostalgia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that started out with, cars from the 50s when they were in movies. Growing up, all of a sudden those 50s cars and those hot rod cars where guys were, had cool hot rods. And, I think that's when it really started. But now Drive to Survive, Ford versus Ferrari, big boost to cars that not only were GT40s and Cobras, because they told the story a little bit about Shelby, but even cars that Ken Miles drove.
Right.
Prime example is the 65 R model.
Yep.
That Ken Miles drove. Well, that brought 4 times the value of a regular R model almost. And it was purely because he drove it.
and not purely because of that movie, but a select few, Shelby enthusiasts were guys who worshipped Ken Miles.
Right.
After the movie,
everyone knows the name.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same today with Drive to Survive, where everybody knows the drivers' names today. They're watching it. It's exciting. It's, the heyday of Formula One. You could argue it's stronger than it was with Niki Lauda and James Hunt.
Sure.
You know, with at the beginning of TV for Formula One.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think so with the Formula One stuff, guys, there's however many new fans, right? And then they'll go and watch a Senna documentary and go, oh, wow, those are some cars to own.
Yep.
Or they'll watch the Schumacher documentary, or, even the Villeneuve documentary and go, wow, these are significant cars to own. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, it's exactly what you're saying. Once people get excited about, let's use Formula One stuff, they get excited because they watch Drive to Survive, and most of them are watch current racing, and then a few of those guys go, oh, I want to know more about the cars, and they start digging into it and see all the other documentaries, and you're right. I think after Drive to Survive, a lot of people started watching the history of Formula One, wanted to understand what was so cool about it. Mm-hmm. And they go back and all of a sudden there's this kind of resurgence of all Formula One cars. It's not just current cars.
Right.
And you can make a good argument. Was Drive to Survive the thing that brought it to the mainstream attention? Yeah. But you can also make the argument of, the science compared to the art. Of if you logically look at race cars being sort of the most expensive cars out there, it used to be Le Mans cars, and still is.
Sure.
Cars that raced at Le Mans.
In the 50s and 60s.
In the 50s and 60s, the Ferraris, the GTOs, the 250 LMs, the Testarossas, the DBR1s for Aston, the D-types for, Jag, and GT40s for Ford. So those cars were the pinnacle and big dollar cars.
Right.
And then a Ferrari Formula One car, like let's go back a few years ago. Let's go back 5 years ago.
Sure.
Or even 10 years ago. When, call it 2015 was the peak of Ferraris maybe, and maybe a little later, but let's count 2015 to 2020.
Right, of those collector car Ferraris.
Right, a GTO is $70-80 million,
right.
The best ones.
Yep.
The best TR is $50-60 million.
Yep.
So those cars are really expensive. At that same time, call it 10 years ago or 8 years ago, the best Schumacher car was probably $4 million.
Right.
And you had
7-time world champion. We're pinnacle of the sport.
Pinnacle of the sport.
Ferrari.
Pinnacle brand.
Yep.
Pinnacle of racing. There's, nothing higher than Formula One. And pinnacle driver possibly of all time. And that's, debatable, but certainly one of them. And it's a fraction. It's like less than 10%.
Right.
Of this car.
Right.
And then you do the math, and again, you go back to the science of it. So, you've made your argument, then you do the math and you go, oh, there's, 34 GTOs or whatever the, exact
Yeah, you
numbers.
look at the numbers of each car, yeah.
And then you look at how many Ferrari Formula One Schumacher cars were there, and then how many that won races. And those numbers are very similar. And they're both great looking cars. And Ferrari's done a really good job of saying, oh, if you want to drive that Formula One car, we'll take it to the track, we'll look after it. You'll feel like a Formula One driver, and, you can use them.
Right.
No different than the GTO. Mm-hmm. So the values just didn't make sense.
Right.
And I think they're coming into their own right now, and that would be one example. Now, you have NASCAR trying to kind of replicate it with their
Netflix series, yeah.
Yeah. And, is it as popular? No, I don't think so. And I've always said, NASCAR, you get a championship winning car, a race winning car with Earnhardt or, Junior or, any Jimmy Johnson or anybody that's won championships and that, you can buy those cars for 100, 150 grand.
Right.
They seem cheap.
Right.
And you can vintage race them. There's a series, and that's starting to grow in popularity. They're safe, reliable, fast, cheap cars to run with great history. They look like a bargain today, but will they go like Formula One cars? I don't think so. Formula is truly a world market.
Right.
NASCAR is very much a U.S. market at best.
Yeah, you don't get told over the radio after you win the Cup championship that you're a world champion.
But it's a different demographic, different feel, different audience.
Right.
Just as hard to win.
Sure. Yeah.
From a drivability point of view, easier to drive, easier to race, easier to look after, but I just don't think they're ever going to be there.
Right. And I think, to some degree, the numbers factor into it as well. You look at a peak season of Jimmy Johnson or Jeff Gordon, and they had 34 cars that year.
For the one driver.
Right. Yeah. Like, people don't realize how many chassis, are kicking around that were championship cars.
Right.
Yes, one car, wrapped up the championship in that last race or wherever it was, but
they had a lot of
cars, whereas Formula One,
2 cars, 3 cars.
2 cars, 3 cars, 4 cars maybe on their big years. And then you go back in the day and it's 1 or 2 cars that the team ran.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So you gotta think about that, I guess. What do you think is next? And I'll leave it up to you for whatever kind of factors, whether it's, people who are into cars getting older or getting younger or nostalgia, as an example, like what happened to E30 M3s. They went from just 15 grand, 20 grand to well over 100 grand.
Sure.
That would have been a great investment if you...
Absolutely.
For, fairly accessible to the average guy who pulled out his savings account, said, I'm going to buy this thing for 12 grand, 13 grand and sell it for over 100 grand in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah. And again, I think that if you look at desirability, the E30 or E36 M3 or, any of those cars, they were a great car. They were a fun car to drive. They're a good looking car. Nobody says, oh, geez, that's an ugly car. And rarer than, let's say, a Corvette or a standard Bimmer or any of that. It was sort of the pinnacle of that, brand. And then look for real special either models or options or things like that you can differentiate between, the average, M3 and something that was in a special color. And I don't know if they had, special colors that you could order or whatever, different interiors, and then start breaking it down to make it special.
So get into the science a little bit.
Get into the science, and then also quality. The art of it. Is it a great original car that's a time capsule? So, when the cars weren't worth much money, so let's say, the cars were worth 20 grand for a long time or 30 grand, whatever the number is. Well, the difference between the good and great at 30 is maybe 5 grand, maybe 10 grand. So the difference between a 70,000 mile M3 and a 3,000 mile M3 is 5 grand. When they're still relatively cheap or you believe in it, buy the best ones. Pay too much at that point, because that gap just exponentially opens up.
Right.
When the cars become valuable.
Right.
And that gap, closes up again once you go over huge numbers. So the difference between the best and the worst of, a $10 million car isn't maybe as big as the best and the worst of $100,000 car.
Right.
Percentage wise.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess tell me a little bit about your thesis on the Ford versus Ferrari, as far as, well, really the Ford versus Ferrari thesis of investing, looking at what lined up, at Le Mans on that grid and the values.
Yeah, I still think that in today's world, GT40s are undervalued. I think Cobras are undervalued. When a GT40 is, take a road car,
sure,
for example, and let's say $7 million, just as a number for a road car, and there's 30 of them. When you compare that to, roughly the same era, a short wheelbase Ferrari, that there's 150 of those cars, and it's $10 million, and one is, of those 30 cars, there's only a handful of good ones because they were
GT40s. Yeah.
They were, even the road cars ended up racing a lot, were beat up, they were rust prone and all sorts of things. So if you look at the two of them, they don't make sense. If you look at how rare those cars are and what they did compared to, if you lined up on the grid of 66 and you had a P3 or a P4 or 67 and you had a Mark II or a Mark IV, and if the Mark II or Mark IV is, $10 to $15 million, depending on the thing, that P3 or P4 on the bottom end is 30.
Right.
On the top end is 60. It's still a fraction of the money, and it beat them.
Right.
The Fords beat them. It did better.
Yeah.
And in my mind, they're just as good looking. So, and maybe I'm biased, but I think there's still some legs there. And I think it's the same with Cobras, real 427 cars. You have 170 cars, call it. And, call a road car at $2.5 million for a great one. And then you compare that to some of the other cars out there. It doesn't logically make sense that they're only that number. You take a Gullwing. So earlier car, both are very iconic cars. So you have two very iconic cars that every collection wants or has or whatever. But one they made, let's just use loose numbers, 1,500. The other they made 200 of.
Right.
One is actually newer and more usable. The Gullwing's hot and, it's not as much fun to drive.
Right.
One is really quick. The other has great technology in it and that. But there's, 5, 6, 7 times as many cars, roughly the same price.
Right.
Doesn't make sense.
Right.
And, there's multiple things you can compare it to that doesn't make sense. Even, you take really rare cars like, Hemi Cuda convertibles or L88 Corvettes, you're talking 20 of those cars. And a great L88 or a 71 Hemi convertible, a stick, let's call the pinnacle of those cars, is $4 million. In my mind, that car looks identical to the base version of that car. You take an L88 Corvette, a 67, it's $4 million. You take a 435 horse Corvette, and it's, $250,000, $300,000, $400,000 for the, great color car.
Yeah.
It's tenfold the money. That logically doesn't make sense because that doesn't translate to very many different cars. Mm-hmm. You can't look at a Cobra and say a comp car, which is kind of the equivalent, is worth, 10 times the money.
It's not. Right.
It's not.
Right.
And one of the cars that is, I had this discussion with another dealer that, is super knowledgeable, and we're talking about alloy Gullwings.
Right.
And, 29 cars or whatever the number is, it brings 4 times the value of a regular Gullwing, looks the same other than the body's alloy, but the doors and hood and both are alloy. And that doesn't translate into Ferraris from that same era. You know, so to me, it logically doesn't make sense. And it doesn't always have to be logic. That's the art part.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
it's not a science.
The science is logically, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
The art says, doesn't matter. That's what they bring and bring consistently.
Right. Right.
Okay. So, but if I were looking at where to invest,
you're looking for that inconsistency.
The inconsistency to the logic.
Right.
Doesn't mean that it's going to change, but at least you have an argument for the change.
Right. Right. So looking at that, you know, even to get more specific. So the examples you're using. So looking at the base car, looking at the ultra rare version of that, and then comparing it to other marks, to a Ford, to a Mercedes, to a Ferrari, to a Lamborghini or whatever, looking at the base and then seeing if there's a discrepancy, if it's only 1-2 times more.
Right.
You know, okay, there might be some legs here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, Ferraris were a great example for a long time. F40s were the cheapest of the supercars. 288 was more and F50 was more. And F50s were lagging too. Enzos were more, LaFerraris were more.
Right.
And the reason, logically, it made sense. It made way more F40s than 288s or F50s and that. But it was by far the most iconic of them.
Sure.
Everybody knew what an F40 was.
Yeah.
And it was half the money. It was better looking. It was just purely numbers. And that comes back to that desirability. And finally, and I remember saying it a bunch of times, you should buy 10 F40s. You know, they're good value compared to the others for the look. And it took COVID to really have people go, wow, those are good looking cars. And now they went from $1 million, $1.5 million to $3 million, even to $4 million for the best ones. And they're hovering now in that 3 to 4 range, depending on how great a car they are. So they doubled in a 3-year period,
right.
4-year period. Yeah.
Right.
So again, it's, you know, take a little bit of the science and a little bit of the art, but buy what you believe in, buy what's good looking. And again, if you're buying what you love, worst case scenario is you're buying something you really enjoy. And if you believe in it, I think usually if you have it long enough, eventually it comes around and has its time if it's a great car.
That's good advice. Yeah. Before I let you go, last question has there been any car or, you know, specific deals or just in general that have been winners that you've passed on?
Oh, I think
what's the biggest one?
I think Ryan has a list of them. he keeps a tally and lets me know how much
we've lost
or haven't made on the cars. But
what's the biggest one you regret not buying?
GT1 Porsche. Yeah. And you know, we could have bought one at $1.5 million and Ryan was like, buy it. And we ended up buying a GT2 Evo.
Right.
Instead, which was, you know,
cool
a great car.
Yeah.
And the GT1 Porsches just went ballistic. And now a good GT1 Porsche is 10, 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's a good one.
And not in that big a period of time.
Right.
You know?
Right. That's good. I think people will enjoy this and probably get a lot out, and you'll probably get a lot of emails. A lot of questions.
Are you crazy?
That was Peter Klutt with the art and science of investing in collector cars. If you guys haven't checked out legendarymotorcar.com, do so. Have a look at the inventory. There's a lot of cars there that were referenced in this video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with some friends. See you next time.